In today's video, I'm going to be addressing 10 of your biggest colour mixing struggles when mixing watercolours. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel we do all things watercolour. We do drawing, we do mixed media, even a little bit of business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. It's completely free. I make at least one free video a week here on YouTube, with extra content for YouTube channel members, and that's all about colour mixing. If you're interested in that, just click the join button to find out more. Now let's get back to today's video. So recently on Facebook, I asked people to tell me what their biggest colour mixing struggles were. Now this is in my Facebook group, and many of my YouTube subscribers are members. Many of you are not, so have a look in the video description for the link. I'll also put it up on the screen. And I asked people what their biggest struggles were, what they were really having difficulty with when it came to mixing their watercolours, mixing their colours. And over the course of a day or so, 10 people answered, and they were really wide-ranging. Some of them were things I'd heard before, and some of them were quite new to me. And so rather than sort of get hundreds of replies and filter, I thought I'm just going to stop the comments at these 10 and answer them all in a video. So today we're going to be answering the struggles and the questions that you asked me about colour mixing. So let's get started with number 1. So the first comment I had was from Krista, and we also had Natasha chiming in on this one as well. And that was how to avoid just making a huge big puddle of muddy colour. It's not a colour that I want. Apparently this colour is often a sort of a brownish purple. If you've ever had this big sort of muddy puddle of colour, and it doesn't matter how much you seem to adjust it, it just keeps getting worse. There are a few things you can do about this. Let's look at them now. Now, sometimes when people ask me about problems they have with colour mixing, it's quite hard for me to know what they're doing because obviously I can't see them through the screen. I can't see what they're doing. But this one, actually, I know exactly what's going on because I've seen it in my art classes so many times. So let's look at what goes wrong when you end up mixing this just huge puddle of colour and it's wrong and you can't seem to get it right. So imagine that I have put a recipe up on my channel for, you know, a grey, and the ingredients are a blue like this one, and some pink and some yellow, and here's the grey that I've mixed. So what happens is this: when people mix, they're not taking into account the fact that some colours are much stronger than others. So the way to avoid this problem, and I'll show you where it goes wrong in a moment, the way to avoid this problem is to know which of the 3 colours or 2 colours or 4 colours that you're mixing together is the strongest, and to make sure that you put it in last and that you start with the lightest colour. Now, very often the lightest colour in a mix like this would be the yellow, because yellow is inherently light. Could be the blue. I'm using this ultramarine here, but if you're using something like a cerulean blue, it could be weak. If you're using something like raw umber, it could be weak. And only really working through your own colours will enable you to learn which are weak and which are strong. Any of the bright purples or bright pinks or anything with phthalo in front of it is likely to be very strong. So let me show you where people go wrong. So they'll go to mix the colour and they'll say, right, so Michelle said it was blue and some yellow, and we need some pink as well. Oh dear. So what's happened here is the pink is much stronger than the other colours in this mix. And so we've put too much of it in and we've ended up with this purple. So what people will do now is they'll try to adjust that colour by balancing it out with other colours. And you just don't seem to, you know, it's gone rather purple, so maybe it needs more pink, and perhaps it needs more blue, and perhaps it needs more yellow, and you just don't seem to get anywhere, and you're just ending up all the time with this sludgy purplish colour, all because we overwhelmed it with a large amount of staining colour. And now, although it's technically possible to get this back to the correct colour by balancing it out with the other colours, you can be in the situation where it would take maybe half a tube of paint to balance out the amount of red or purple or bright green or whatever it is you've gone wrong with. So what I advise you to do is, if you've gone badly wrong and you've just got this big puddle of the wrong colour, you can either rinse your brush and start again in another well, because really all you're doing at this point is wasting more paint. It will take so much yellow and so much blue to counteract this pink that it's just not worth it. You can either start again, or what you can do is just take a small amount of that colour across and then work the other colours in from there. And you're going to have a much better chance then of getting the colour you need. You can put some more pink in, or you could just go back to that colour you made originally that had a lot of pink in, and you can start balancing out your colours from there until you mix a better colour. Now I've got a nice grey here. It's still rather greenish. If I want it a bit more blue like this one or a bit lighter, I can add more blue paint and I can add a bit more water and balance everything out. So the problem with the big puddle of muddy colour is overuse of staining and strong colours and then just adding more colours in a futile attempt to balance them out. If you've gone too far with a staining colour, don't underestimate how strong they can be. You could end up wasting so much paint adjusting that colour. It's better to start again or to move a small amount of it over to another well and adjust it from there. This next one made me laugh because it was just one word, but we all instantly understood what she meant. This was Yvonne, and the word was greens. They can be a real problem. Let me give you a few simple strategies for getting nice greens in your paintings. So what's the problem with greens? The problem with greens is getting a wide range of greens that are interesting colours. Some are bright, some are subtle, some are dull, some are warm, some are cool. By doing this, you'll get a really natural look to your paintings and there'll be a lot of interest in them. Unfortunately, some beginner's sets either don't include green or they just include one green. Now, I've got a colour here and I'll just bring it forward so you can see. This is a colour by Jackman's. This one's called Spring Green. It's not a pure phthalo green, but it's based on phthalo. You can see it's very bright. Many of the greens in beginner's sets will be a colour like this, or a bit bluer. This one's been adjusted with a little bit of yellow pigment. Now, it's a great colour, isn't it? But of course, if you paint your whole landscape this colour, it may not be very natural looking. But a colour like this can be endlessly adjusted. So we can water it down, make it lighter. We could also adjust it by adding some warm yellow. This will make it a much sunnier colour. If we want to warm it up but dull it down, we could use some yellow ochre. Almost all sets include yellow ochre. Look at the difference between this where it's adjusted and where it's not. We could dull it down by adding some of its opposite, which is red, or in this case we're going to use pink. So I'm going to add a tiny bit of pink into that mix and we can dull the colour down. I could cool it down with some ultramarine, make it much bluer, or I could make it more turquoise by adding some phthalo, and I could brighten it right up with some Hansa or some lemon. I'm using Hansa yellow here. So you can see that from one ready-made green, we can get all of these different variations just by adding. And even though you may have a green in your box, don't discount all of the yellows and blues that you have as well. This is my beginner's set here and I have 2 yellows, I have 2 blues. I also have other options. I have Payne's Grey, which has a lot of blue in and can be used to mix dull greens. I also have yellow ochre, which again can be made to mix very dull greens. So in fact, I've got 6 options here that I can mix greens from because I've got 3 yellows here, 2 blues and a grey that's mostly blue pigment. So the way to get interesting greens is to make yourself a swatch card and to swatch all of the greens that you can possibly imagine. Write down the recipes underneath so you know what you've made. You can make them like a map reference with all the yellows down the side and all the blues along the top, and then where they meet in the middle you can mix those two together. Remember that within any one mix of green you have endless variations. So let's mix diarylide yellow and phthalo blue. Now I've got this green, but this is just one version of it. So I could add more of the yellow. I could add more of the blue. To any of these, I could add more water and make a lighter colour. I could add more pigment and make a darker colour. I could water that down. I could use the blue alone with only the tiniest amount of yellow, or the yellow with only the tiniest amount of blue. I could water that down. So this is all one mix here. This is all phthalo blue and diarylide yellow. Take some time to explore your palette and swatch out your greens. And if they're ready-made greens and they're a bit on the bright side, take some time to mix other things with them and see how many adjustments and how many new greens you can come up with. Just playing with the most basic of sets and one ready-made green, I've already mixed all of these. I could probably come up with 40 more. At this point in the video, as always, can I ask you please to remember to click that like button, that thumbs up for me. YouTube rewards channels with audience interaction. If you can like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people. I can help teach more people how to paint and draw. I'm so grateful to all of you who watch me here on YouTube. Next up, we have Kathy, who asked how to mix on the paper, by which I mean mix colours on the paper. We're going to talk about this more later in the video, but let's just have a look at that basic question first. This is something that I often do in my own paintings. So in order to mix on the paper, the paint needs to be wet enough, and it depends if you want to mix a colour fully on the paper. So we can take some pink here and let's mix some yellow ochre in. We can mix like this, and here is our paint mixed on the paper without having to worry about getting a palette well dirty. You can see it flows and it's fairly wet. There aren't any puddles to lead to unevenness, and it's mixed quite nicely. And I worked fairly quickly as well. Then of course there's the option of mixing on the paper and yet retaining the original colours. So in other words, we get an overlap where the colours mix in the middle, but we also retain the original colours. Now the trick to doing this is not to have one side wetter than the other. If I'd allowed this pink to get dry or semi-dry, then I'd place this colour next to it, and this colour was much wetter. It would have spread across and made lots of back runs and drying lines. So if you want to mix multiple colours on the paper like this, make sure they're all an equal amount of wetness, and make sure that you work quickly. Next up, Wendy said that she often doesn't mix enough paint for the paper. It's so frustrating, isn't it, when you run out of paint halfway across an area? Let me show you how to make sure you've mixed enough. So not mixing enough colour. There are two reasons for this. One is that you simply don't mix enough colour, and the other is that the palette is sometimes too small. So I've got a palette here with, fairly small wells, and even this is much bigger than some of the wells you get that are built into perhaps a paint tin that you might have, a little mixing well on the lid. You really don't stand much chance of mixing enough paint if you just haven't got a very big well. And you know what happens then? It starts to spill over the edge, and then another colour starts bleeding in, and it can all be very difficult. Now this palette I've got here isn't bad. It's got quite big mixing wells, but some of them are very tiny. I like to keep a selection of little pots like this. Now you can get these. This probably had hummus in, or some kind of dip from the takeaway. Or I've got this one here, which I bought in a charity shop. That's a thrift store if you're in the US, and if you're in Australia, they're called an op shop. Don't understand that at all, but that's what I've heard. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the water. So don't be afraid, especially if you're mixing a sky, to start with the water first. So I can pour some water in. I'm going to use phthalo blue here, which is a staining pigment. Of course, it's quicker if I use tube paint, but I can still achieve the same with pan paints or dried paints. And think about the brush you're applying with as well. If you're applying with some kind of huge, large, flat brush, or a really big brush like a size 20 or something, the brush alone is going to soak up so much paint. And then there's a load of paint that's going to sink into the paper. I suggest you mix at least double what you think you need, possibly double it again. If you mix a puddle of paint that you think is 3 or 4 times as much as you need, then hopefully you won't run out. Remember, the larger the area and the larger the brush, the more paint you're going to have to mix. Some papers are particularly absorbent as well. I tried Arches paper years ago, and I don't get on with it actually because it's very, very absorbent. It's good quality paper, but if you do use a paper like that and you know how absorbent it is, make sure you mix enough. Even this amount here would only be enough for a sky on a small board. If I was painting a very large painting, I'd mix even more than this. So the answer to mixing enough paint for a large area is to use a separate dish and possibly to add the water first. Next, Colleen said she has trouble remembering how much pigment to water ratio, and also she's not sure when you should mix on the paper and when you should mix in the palette. Let's look at a few strategies around this. So understanding how much pigment and how much water to use really has so many variables that it's difficult for me to give a strict answer, but the paint should flow. Unless you're using some kind of dry brush technique, you want the paint to flow. Now remember, colours have different strengths, and you may want a colour lighter or darker. So here you can see the brush goes all the way along, and I can go again, and I haven't run out of paint. Often problems like this, not knowing how much water to use, can be caused by using a brush that's too small. You see how this brush holds so much water, and there's nothing special about the brand. It's just that it's a large brush and I can keep painting with it and I get this lovely smooth effect. If you're finding this is happening and you're getting a lot of dryness and a lot of gaps along the edges like this is a sign that you don't have enough water on your brush. Now this can absolutely be used as a technique in its own right. It's called dry brush. But unless that's what you're aiming for, you need to use enough water and enough paint. As I said, pigments vary so much in strength, so I can't tell you exactly how much paint to mix in. Now, about whether you should mix your colours like we did previously on the paper, or whether you should mix separately like this in a well or a dish, I would say that depends firstly on the area that you're covering. If you want to cover an area with flat colour, well, we can do a small area like this, no problem. See how nice and flat this is mixed. There's no gradations, it's all mixed in nicely. But I'd never dream of doing this if I was covering a whole sky. I would mix up paint like this. So I had enough and I could keep dipping in. You also want to consider granulation. If you do mix in a well like this and you have a granulating colour, then each time you put your brush in, you'll need to stir in order that the paint doesn't separate. This isn't a granulating colour here, but if it was, then all those little heavy pigments would fall to the bottom. So generally speaking, it's less about the colour and more about the area which you need to cover and how smooth and even you want that colour to be. If you don't need your colour to be even, or if you want to, mix different colours together, then mixing on the paper can give beautiful and unique effects like this that we simply can't get by pre-mixing the paint, but they are, of course, going to be textured and going to have variation. So if you're working in a relatively small area and you want blended effects like this and varying colours and varying textures, then mix on the paper. But if you want a large, smooth, flat area, then it's always best to mix in a little dish or a palette well. But do remember, if there's any granulating colour in there whatsoever, to stir every time you dip your paintbrush in. That way you'll keep applying the same colour and it won't separate out with some of the pigments falling to the bottom of the dish, leading to an uneven application. Next up, Susan says she often makes a nice colour almost by accident and then she forgets how she made that colour. Let's look at a good way of keeping a note. Now, many of you may have made colour charts like this. I've got mine in a binder. This one here is a mix of oranges. This one here, I'm just swatching out basic colours from dark to light. Years ago, what I used to have is in the back, and it was just blank. It had some squares drawn on it, but it didn't have any writing on. What I would do is I would just, if I was working on a particular colour or I was painting something and I just happened to come across a really unusual mix, I would just paint a little swatch on the paper like this. And then I'd write down how I'd made it. This one here was a bit of spring green and I just mixed it with some permanent rose. And after a few months of working, what I found was that the back sheet of my colour mixing charts had these beautiful colours in, so there'd be all these unusual colours there. So here's another one. I've mixed my Pyrrole red with my Payne's grey. Can I remember how to spell Pyrrole red? Is that right? I'm not sure it's got that many R's in. The thing with colour charts though is they don't have to be perfect. They only have to be an accurate reminder of what you did, and we can make a whole sheet in the back of our colour charts just for swatching like this. Keep it next to you when you're working and make sure that you make a quick swatch and a quick note of what you've used. Now, Sharon said that she finds it hard to get that perfect shade of red, or indeed of peach, that isn't orange or pink. Now, red is a primary colour, so to some extent it's about choosing the right red to start with. Let's look at some reds and see if we can get some solutions. So any red that's watered down is going to look like a pink, but what you're looking for if you want a true red is a more warm red, a scarlet-based red. Now, as I said, red is a primary colour, so if the only dark red you've got in your palette is something like alizarin crimson, which is very pink, although it's a dull pink, you're never going to get that bright red. So if this is an issue for you, I suggest you find yourself a scarlet red to add to your paints. So this is one of my favourite scarlet reds, and this is a permanent light red from Talon's Rembrandt. This is what I would call a really orange-based red. And here we are. They also do a cadmium red deep, which is a little darker and a little less orange. Now, if we water either of these down, this one will look pink and this one will look orange, but it's a very natural rose-based pink. It's not that bright sort of Barbie pink that we imagine with some of the madders. Another colour you can try, which many brands have, is a Scarlet Lake. This one is fabulous. Now, when I water this one down, it does look very peachy. There was actually an SAA colour years ago that they called Permanent Rose, but actually was a very strong, bright peach like this. Now, peach generally is made from a pinkish red mixed with yellow. But if you want to avoid it being too pink, then stay away from things like Permanent Rose and mix from some of these warmer reds. Another bright red I've got here, this is from my flower painting set, and this is Jackman's Poppy Red. Again, this is a very orange-based red. Now, for getting a peach, we can mix a light yellow in. This one is slightly warmer than a lemon, so this is Buttercup from my flower set. A similar colour would be something like a cadmium yellow light. I would be inclined to mix it with something like this Scarlet Lake. And you can adjust it until you get the shade you're looking for. Another interesting colour for mixing peach is this Pyrrole Red. So this is from my Essentials set by Jackman's. Now, on the surface it looks like a bright red, but actually when watered down it is somewhat pink. And again, this is going to make a great peach colour. But overall, I would say that mostly the issue, if you can't get a bright red, is just that you simply don't have one in your box. As I said, these are primary colours. We can't mix these from anything. So if your beginner's set contains only an alizarin crimson, a permanent rose, or possibly some kind of deep cadmium, you may need to go out and purchase another colour in order to get that bright, true red, as it may simply be missing from your box. Next up, Cheryl says that she struggles with getting colours that are just dull and lifeless. Now, this is actually an issue that is far broader than just colour mixing. There are other things that can affect how bright your colours look too. I've made a whole other video about that. I'll link to it in the description of this video. But for now, let's look at some simple strategies. So ending up with colours that are generally dull and lifeless. Now, there are many reasons for this, but let's look at some of the most usual causes. Now, first of all, I know it's a cliche, but change your water. Now, I have this water here. I've been swatching in between making this video. I've been swatching for my Colour Mixing Academy members on channel memberships. We've been testing out lemon yellows and comparing between brands. So I've got this very yellow water here. Now, if I was going to mix a green next, this water actually, it wouldn't be too bad at all because yellow's part of green, isn't it? However, if I was going to mix a purple next, I was dipping into that yellow water. That's a colour opposite and it's going to dull everything. So do consider your colour opposites. Another problem, of course, is mucky palettes. Not only mucky mixing wells like these ones, but also the paints themselves. Again, I've been dipping in here with the blue and I've got all of this looking really mucky. If I try and mix an orange from this now, it's going to be a right mess. Now, it's impossible to work without getting into some form of muddle. But if you're about to mix a colour, think about colour opposites. Again, if I was going to mix a green next, well, it's not ideal to have all this muck in there already, but it probably won't affect it too much. But if I'm going to mix an orange next, what a mess that's going to be. So let's get a little bit of red, which is all polluted with green. And I'm not going to get a very bright colour at all. As I said, there's many reasons for muddy colours and muddy looking paintings. It's not all about colour mixing, surprisingly, but a lot of it is as simple as colour hygiene. I used to walk around my art classes and somebody would say, "Oh, Michelle, I don't know why all my colours look mucky." I used to look at their water, their paint water, and honestly, it looked like soup. Not good soup either. Sometimes it really is as simple as palette hygiene, as changing your water. And remember that you must do this particularly when you're going to a colour opposite. If you can't remember your colour opposites, just think about whether the colours seem to be related or if it's a completely different colour. If it is, then you need to make sure that you are working with crystal clear water and absolutely pure paints in order to keep those bright, clean colours. Now, Tara mentioned an example where she might have something like a blue sky and she might put another colour in and she feels that that colour, well, the word she used was plop. She feels that it just plops there and doesn't mix in. Now, the amount a colour mixes into a previous colour will depend on several things, including water levels and granulation. So let's look at that next. So let's look at this example that Tara gave me of painting a blue sky and then adding another colour, and it just plops. Now, this is probably because everything's just got too dry. So I can take some pink here and pop it in. Now, you see it doesn't go anywhere, and that's because the colour is drier than the surface it's going onto. If I want it to spread, I can do this. If I want it to spread right the way across, you have to give it a bit of aggravation. I'd be typically on a large sky using a big flat brush for this. You've got to have it wet enough and you've got to mix. And don't be frightened of it. Imagine you're pasting wallpaper. Now, it can sometimes as well be to do with the paper that you're using. I've got some paper in my stash that somebody gave me, and it's kind of like a mixed media paper. It's got a very artificial looking square grain to it. If you've got paper like that, it can be really hard to spread your paint evenly. Conversely, if you're using paper that's too smooth, that can not aid the pigment spreading out. Now, you see I've got some little speckles here. Now, if this happens, it's likely that, like I am here for a YouTube demo, I'm working on cheap paper, which means that the more you scrub at it, the more the paper's going to bead up. In that case, you may need to go up to a cotton paper. If you know you're going to be making a lot of adjustments and working on top again and again and scrubbing at your paper. But the amount that your paint spreads and what happens will depend on different water levels. So I had even water levels when I put that pink in, and it blended it smoothly, but it stayed put, and then I could spread it out if I wanted to. Now let's look at what's going to happen here. I'll add a bit of this red simply because it's wetter. This is partly dry now, so what happens now if I go onto this with paint that's wetter than the surface it's going onto? Now it's going to spread out more like this. And this is physics at work. It's trying to seek a level by spreading. Now, if I wanted to stop that from happening, I would need to spread across, but just spreading along the edge like that won't help because I've just moved the edge. I would need to go across the whole area, and so that I evened out the water levels. Now, the last comment I had was from Todd, and it was different actually to all of the rest of the comments, and it wasn't actually a question at all, but I'm going to speak about it anyhow. Todd was talking about having had cataract surgery on one eye, and only once he'd had this done, he realised how much his vision had been affected before by the cataracts. And he said that what it had done is it made everything sort of much more muted and dull, and also made the colours much warmer. So he was now left with one eye that saw things fairly brightly and clearly, and another eye which saw things more muted, and so he had to remember when he was matching colours to cover one eye. So let's talk briefly about eyesight issues. And I did speak in last week's video about colour blindness, which is very common amongst men. So you may have colour blindness, you may have issues with cataracts. You may even just have a struggle like I've got, which is that I've got varifocal glasses now, and I don't see anywhere near as clear through the reading part of them as I do when I place my face without glasses, 4 inches from the paper. So let's talk about the difficulty of not seeing colours as they actually are. Now, as I said in the last video, there's no right or wrong way to see colours. Now, Todd is lucky he's got the option of covering up one eye so he can see better from the other eye. But you may find that your vision is, for some reason, permanently affected, and that you maybe don't see colours as other people see colours. At the end of the day, does that really matter? Because colour doesn't exist in real life. It simply is the way our brains interpret light bouncing off of a surface. And so we do all, in fact, see colour slightly differently, even if we've got perfect vision. And from a scientific point of view, there's no right or wrong way to see colour. The colours that you see are just as valid, even if they might not be the colours that the majority of the population are seeing. And when it comes to things like eye strain, it really will do you good to take regular breaks, to look at your work from a distance. The other thing you can do is just look at things a long way away. If you have visual issues like me and you're short-sighted or long-sighted, I appear to be both now, happy days, you can actually get to a point where your vision goes quite kind of blurry or a bit double because you've been staring at something for so long. Have you ever done that thing where you've been staring at something up close and then you look up and everything is a bit, ugh? What will do your eyes really good is to actually just gaze into the distance for a while. So if you do have visual issues, then it can be really, really helpful just to stop what you're doing for a while, go for a walk and just look at things that are a long way away. Taking a break and scrolling Instagram is not giving your eyes any rest. You need to be looking at things that are far in the distance. And remember that if you have visual issues that change the way you see things, your view of the world as an artist is just as valid as anyone else's. So this video has been a little bit different from the ones I usually do in that I've been answering subscribers' questions. Let me know if this is a format that you enjoy. I'd be happy to do some more about all sorts of subjects. And if you have your own colour mixing problems, do put them in the comments of this video. Perhaps I'll make a part 2. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. I've got all sorts of good things down there for you. Many of them are free. We've got some free downloadable PDFs. I've even got a free watercolour painting course that you can take. If you're really interested in getting to grips with colour and colour mixing, you can also join my Colour Mixing Academy. You'll want my Tier 2 channel membership. It's incredibly good value. If you click the join button below, you'll just see a couple of options, one of which is a small donation to the channel just to say thank you for the free content, and the other is where you get an extra video once a week all about colour mixing. So if, like me, you absolutely love colour and you can't wait to learn more about it, that's an option that I have for you. I'll also put another colour mixing video up for you to enjoy next. You can watch that one right now.